Hello again, I am Blunty in Trafalgar Square. Behind me, a World War I tank. Well, it's not actually a World War I tank. What it is a replica tank built for Steven Spielberg's movie, The War Horse. And 100 years ago today, in fact, at 5:20 a.m., September 15th, 1916, the first tank went into battle. Commanded by Captain Harold Mortimer, the tank was called Daredevil. Appropriately enough, you have to be a bit of a daredevil to drive the very first tank into the very first tank battle in history.
The Mark IV, built in 1917 and produced through almost to the end of the following year. It was the first truly mass-produced tank in the world. 1,200 or so of them were built and put into service. It is, in fact, very similar to the tank that started it all, the Mark I, with the exception of slightly thicker armour plating to cope with the new anti-tank bullets that had been developed after the Mark I scared the bejeebus out of the Germans. Other slight differences include the sponsons on the side. They were modified to slide inboard on a rail system for squeezing through tight places and forests and things. They also made the cannons shorter to help keep them out of the way too. And finally, the last major modification was moving the fuel tank from the front and the top to an externally mounted and armoured place at the back, underneath. In the Mark I, it was rather poorly positioned, as you may imagine, and it was vulnerable to enemy fire. Should it be hit by enemy munitions, it kind of set the whole tank on fire. Not terrific. The size of the fuel tank was also increased by 20 extra gallons to extend the useful range of the tank. The Mark IV, deployed in force almost 400 tanks strong at the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917, smashed through the German line. This particular tank, as I mentioned, was made for the film War Horse. The production crew came to the Bovington Tank Museum to photograph and take exact measurements of their authentic Mark IV, and it turned out the recreation they made was so wonderfully accurate, at least from the outside, after the movie had wrapped production, the Bovington Tank Museum purchased it. So now they have a tank that looks just like an authentic Mark IV from World War I, except this one they can drive around for displays and shows without worrying so much about damaging one of the last Mark IVs on the planet, clattering about with its fragile century-old engineering, and allowing them to keep it preserved and safe.
Churchill, my grandfather, if not completely the father, was most definitely the midwife of this remarkable weapon of war which transformed the battlefield. On the 23rd of September 1914, Winston Churchill wrote a detailed memorandum from the Admiralty about the urgent need to develop a mechanical device to influence and move trench warfare on. In December 1914, Sir Maurice Hankey, the Secretary to the Committee of Imperial Defence, circulated the work of a visionary soldier at the Ministry of Defence at the War Office, Colonel Swinton, who had independently come to the same conclusion of the need for a weapon of this sort. On the 5th of January, Churchill responded again from the Admiralty, urging immediate action. And this is what he said: "It would be quite easy in a short term to fit up a number of steam tractors with small armoured shelters in which men and machine guns could be placed, which would be bulletproof. Used at night, they would not be affected by artillery fire to any extent. The Caterpillar system would enable trenches to be crossed quite easily, and the weight of the machine would destroy all wire entanglements. 40 or 50 of these engines, prepared in great secrecy and brought into position at nightfall, could advance quite certainly into the heart of the enemy's trenches, smashing away all the obstructions and sweeping the trenches where their machine gun fire and with grenades thrown from the top. By the end of that month, Churchill, having enlisted the help of the Duke of Westminster, who was an officer in the Armoured Car Division of the Royal Naval Air Service, and other officers, started to drive forward this plan with great vigour and gave £70,000 from the Admiralty funds to kick-start the development of the tank. Ladies and gentlemen, no weapon of war was ever brought to the battlefield with more impressive speed and secrecy than this tank. The procurement department at the Ministry of Defence should use this example as an example of best practice. And barely 8 months after its improbable outing at Foster's factory in Lincoln, the tank took part in the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. Ladies and gentlemen, 100 years on, we should honour the memory of those who developed these extraordinary weapons and the immense sacrifice in 2 world wars by those who fought in tanks and changed the face of battle forever. No government should ever forget the extraordinary power of the presence of armour on the battlefield. And I commend the wonderful work done by the Tank Museum at Bovington to keep the importance of this remarkable history alive. Thank you very much.
Now, after sitting around in Trafalgar Square for a few hours for media and onlookers, it was in fact driven down the road and through the Great Marble Arch, a magnificent triumphal arch and one of the many iconic London landmarks, and itself almost 90 years older than the tank. Or at least the original tank that this tank is a recreation of. In an upcoming video, I'll be heading to the Bovington Tank Museum, where I'll be able to dig into more detail about the history of the tank and get a good look at the Mark I itself, as well as dozens upon dozens upon dozens of other kinds of tank. Very excited to see the Mark I, one of the very last surviving examples of the world's first true tank. Meanwhile, a little later in the day, I came across the Mark IV again, now sitting in stark contrast but wonderfully complementary somehow next to a 2016 Challenger 2 main battle tank. Laser rangefinders, thermal imaging, 120mm chrome-lined rifled main cannon, carbon fibre and steel laminated armour, chain guns, and a gallop of 37 miles per hour. While the 3-mile-an-hour Mark IV, built to let infantry march in pace with it and to clamber over trenches, squatted, rhomboid, proud, and full of magnificent history and countless stories next to the somehow boring-looking modern tank, which just, well, that looks like a tank, doesn't it? And almost somehow sterile in all of its science. But it is amazing to think that Winston Churchill's dream of mighty land ships is 100 years old now and still relevant to defence and warfare. Amazing.
But as spectacular and interesting as this is, it really is just sort of part 1 of my adventure here in London with World of Tanks for the celebration of 100 years of tanks. But yeah, I want to thank Wargaming World of Tanks once more for bringing me to old Blighty to celebrate 100 years of tanks being a thing. Thanks for watching. I am Blunty, and we'll catch you next time.